Welcome to The Big Picture. I'm Phil Arno. TV shows us a glimpse of the world outside of our immediate reality. It shows us things that happen or can happen to people out there, somewhere. But TV is a buffer. As it unfurls violence or tragedy, as it scares us or shocks us, it's careful also to protect us from too much reality. I know because for many years as a journalist, it was my job to be a filter. I would see things on the streets, terrible things, and I would have to think of ways to tell or show you, the public, what was going on around you without being too graphic. Unless you're a cop or a firefighter, or maybe a news person or some other professional that works the streets, chances are that you, thankfully, are not that familiar with how rough life can get on occasion. The downside of that is that as you sit there comfortably, secure in the thought that bad things happen to other people, you just might be tempted to take certain things for granted. My hope is that this program will remind you to look at your family, look at your friends and your home, and smile and cherish every moment that you have with those precious people and surroundings. Because my guest on The Big Picture this week was sitting in her home about 10 years ago, almost to this day, much like you are right now. And she was watching TV when the world literally came crashing down around her. On February 12th, 2009, Karen Wielinski was sitting in her home on Long Street in Clarence Center when fate and Flight 3407 changed her life forever. Welcome to the show, Karen.
Thank you. I appreciate your having me.
It's sad. We're glad that you're here to talk about this. You lost your husband on that night, and you miraculously, with your daughter, you managed to get out of the house after the aircraft came down on your house, and it was chaos. It was a horrible scene. Let's first start with that experience. What do you tell people when they ask you about what happened that night?
Well, as you were saying, how life can change in an instant, and you know, you think you're safe in your home, but you just never know. And that night, my husband and I had been in a family room at the back of the house for most of the evening, and I would say around 10 o'clock, he had left the room. Then he came back, and when he asked how long the program we were watching still had to run, I had told him, and I mean, I'm so thankful that this is my last experience with my husband, but he just hopped up off the couch and he said, "I don't have time for that," and kind of smiled. So, I mean, my last memory, he made me laugh, which is great. But so he left the room, and when I changed the channel, I could see the time, and it was about 10, almost 10:15. So within seconds after he left that room, as you said, the whole world came crashing down. And, you know, I think for a few moments, I even wondered if I was alive. And the ironic thing is, just before the plane crashed, I did hear a sound that was different than what we usually would hear, because we were right on the flight path. And I remember thinking to myself, first of all, like, what is that sound? And then also thinking, if that's a plane, it could hit something. And like, all of a sudden, like, the walls came crashing down. So I did question whether I was alive. I realized I was sitting on a little love seat, and I realized there was an opening to my right. There was something like blocking that little entrance. I tried to push it, it didn't move. So then I yelled, and in case someone might have been outside, but I didn't wait because I knew my situation was not good. So I once again tried to move whatever that item was that was blocking, and it moved the second time. So miracle number one that night, it moved. So I stood on the arm of the love seat and pulled myself up. And in the meantime, my daughter Jill was in a front upstairs bedroom when the plane crashed. She was knocked off the bed, and she immediately could see flames towards the front of the house by the windows. So she just basically felt her way, on the walls that were still existing, found an opening, and what we learned later, she slid down to the ground, probably on the wing of the plane. So she could not go forward to Long Street, so she went to the back of the house. And just as I was coming out of this hole, Jill rounded the corner, and she actually saw me coming out of this hole. See, that just gives me chills saying that. I think miracle number 2 that night was that Jill and I found each other so quickly. Such tragedy occurred that night. But I think people forget that, there were a couple miracles too. Just the fact that Jill and I survived. And so we just, she wanted to know where her dad was. I think because I basically knew where Doug was in the house, because he had just left the family room. When I saw the wreckage, I think I just knew he was gone. There was just like no way he could survive. So, she wanted to go find him, but when I realized the size of the plane and fuel and flames, I knew we had to get out of there. So we did. We just ran behind the houses on Long Street and, found neighbors, luckily.
It's amazing how things, as you said, can change in an instant. Everything that happened, I know because I've gone through something similar. I had an experience like that. Things get kind of burned into your memory and are quite clear. You never forget certain things that happen. People think that the trauma would make you kind of block out all that, but it doesn't go away. You remember everything very clearly.
And I'm really glad the day after the crash, my sister-in-law's sister worked for a radio station at the time. And when we turned on the TV that morning after and saw the news crawl under, that was really the first indication I had as to how many people were actually on the plane. And thus the book title, because it said 49 on the plane and 1 on the ground. I knew that family and friends were going to wonder, well, what about the rest of us, what happened to us? So that's when I contacted my sister-in-law's sister. But I'm so glad that I talked to her that day, because I feel like 10 years later, if I would tell people what happened that day, they would say to me, how can you remember? That was 10 years ago. But I still say what I told her that day is what I still say today. So I'm kind of glad I did that at least.
The community in a situation like that steps forward and must have really made a difference.
Definitely.
At that time.
We had so much support after the crash. I worked for the Clarence School District at the time, and they handled so many things for me. They handled the memorial service we had for Doug at the middle school. I mean, they handled, the reporters that were calling the school, and just, friends and family who just came and did whatever they could for us. And I mean, I wasn't even aware what was going on in the community, but I would learn later how people had just bonded together to help in any way they could. They wanted to help in any way they could.
Now, to me, that almost brings more emotion, to me than any other element, is when you know that so many good people can come forward.
It renews your faith in the human race when you see how people do come together. And one thing that really, say, moments that stick in your mind, I think it was probably maybe 3 or 4 days after the crash. The other family members had gone to the site previously, but our family went separately after them. And when we got there, I mean, by that time, I think it was only 3 days after, but after, I mean, everything was basically cleaned up already. It was crazy. I think you could still see the tail of the plane. I think that was still there. But, you know, they were working, but the whole area, the whole lot was surrounded by the workers, police officers, sheriffs, like out of respect for us for coming. And I remember, like, when we left, and it was raining a little bit, and I remember, like, you know, just going up to some of them and just, you know, thanking them for everything they did. And on the 5th anniversary, when I went to a service, and that was the first time I went to the site at night, one of those officers was talking, and he remembered me talking to them. I mean, I just couldn't believe that he remembered that. But it just showed how people, you know, came together to just try and ease the pain of all of us.
Out of this experience, was there ever a moment when you experienced or when bitterness kind of came into the experience?
You know, I can't. Very slightly, maybe. I don't know. I think I didn't really have time to be bitter. There was so much that had to be done in that first year. And, you know, I think, you know, your mother instincts kick in. And I knew I had to be there for my girls and, you know, lessen their pain in any way I could. So you know, of course you think, you know, why did this happen to us? But I wouldn't call that bitterness, and you can't really think too much about the whys because it'll drive you nuts. Right. So yeah, I can't say bitterness would be a feeling that I had, no.
Well, you know, for the people watching, you have to look within yourselves to think about how you might deal with something so shocking and so life-changing. Karen has come through this. You know, it's an experience. None of us would want to do that. She's written a book as part of her therapy. Experience and therapy. You know, it's something that she's got. You've got a website.
Yes.
And a scholarship fund that you've started.
Yes.
And the book. There's several things that if you're interested, I highly recommend that you look into. We're going to wrap up this segment, and we'll be back shortly to talk about other elements of this story. We'll be back right after this.